If I had died that week, the only person surprised would have been the one who caused it. That's not a figure of speech. When the pharmacist told me my insurance had been dropped and my blood pressure medication would run $340 cash, I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I just put my wallet back in my coat and walked out into the parking lot and stood there a minute before I could remember where I'd left my truck. Behind me, through the glass, I could see the next customer already stepping up to the counter like I'd never been there at all. To everyone in that store, I was just another old man who couldn't keep his insurance straight. Nobody in that pharmacy and nobody in my family had any idea what I was actually sitting on. And nobody knew that the woman who'd quietly canceled that insurance believed she was one signature away from every dollar I had. She figured a 63-year-old man who fixed boats for a living wouldn't notice his own life being rearranged out from under him. She was wrong about that. And by the time the truth came out, she'd learned exactly how wrong. My name is Walter Kessler. I'm 63 years old, and I've lived my whole life in Bristol, Rhode Island, 3 streets back from the harbor, in a house I bought in 1994, with money I saved, working other men's boats before I ever owned one of my own. For 38 years I've built and repaired wooden hulls, the old kind. The kind most yards won't touch anymore because nobody trains for it and nobody's patient enough to do it right. My hands look like they've been through a wood chipper. My back sounds like a screen door when I get up in the morning. I raised my daughter alone after my wife passed, and for most of my life the nicest thing I owned was a good set of chisels. I wore the same canvas work jacket to every family dinner for the better part of a decade, and nobody ever said a word about it because nobody figured a man like me had any reason to dress different. That was fine by me. I had other things occupying my mind. If you've ever been the person at a family table who everybody claims to love and nobody actually listens to, you know the particular flavor of that silence. You're the one who gets asked how you're doing, and nobody waits for the answer. You're background noise with a pulse. It isn't cruelty exactly. It's slower than that. It's just being turned down, notch by notch, until you're barely audible even to yourself. My daughter, Renee, is 39. She married a good man, Marcus, 10 years back, and together they've done well a real estate business he runs, and she partly manages the books for a house up in Barrington with a lawn service and a security gate that never seems to close all the way. It took them the better part of a decade to get there, and I was proud of every inch of that climb. But Marcus's mother, Diane, moved in with them 18 months ago after her second husband passed, and Diane is a different kind of animal altogether. She's 61, handled money for wealthy families for 25 years before she retired, the sort of woman who can size up a room in the time it takes to hang her coat and file every person in it under a heading in her head. I recognized what she was doing the very first time I met her, because I do the same thing, only with rotted transom wood instead of people. That Thanksgiving at Renee's house, the place smelled like turkey and cinnamon and somebody's expensive perfume laid on a little too heavy. There was a fire going in the good fireplace, the one that only gets used for company. Snow was starting outside, the wet, heavy kind that comes off the bay this time of year in Rhode Island. My grandson, Toby, was upstairs asleep, 4 years old, worn out from running around all afternoon. Diane's people were there too, her sister, a couple of old colleagues from her banking days, a neighbor who'd come for coffee and ended up staying through dinner. I arrived at 4. Renee met me at the door, took my coat with a smile that didn't quite make it to her eyes, and steered me toward the far end of the table, past the good chairs, to the one with the short leg that always rocked a little on the hardwood. I sat down. I didn't mention it. I never do. That's not weakness. That's a choice, and I'll tell you why it matters before we're through. Marcus sat across from Diane, and I watched my son-in-law that evening the way I used to watch a hull for stress cracks looking for the hairline that tells you something's about to give. He wasn't unhappy, not outright. He just had the look of a man who'd been nodding along with someone for so long the nodding had become a permanent posture. He barely glanced my direction all night. Dinner rolled along, and the conversation moved around me instead of through me. When I tried to bring up the Patriots game, Diane smoothly steered everybody toward a cruise she and her sister were planning, and the table followed her like she was holding the leash. And I want to be honest with you because this is the part that stuck with me longer than anything that happened after. It wasn't the insurance. It wasn't the money. It was watching my own daughter sit quiet while somebody rearranged her father like a piece of furniture nobody remembered ordering. Right before dessert, Diane tapped her wine glass with a spoon, one clean ring, and the room went still the way it does for people who've never once doubted they'd be listened to. She smiled around the table and said she wanted to say something. Her voice was calm, rehearsed, the voice of a woman who'd run this exact moment through her head more than a few times already. She said that with Toby getting older and the family growing, she and Marcus and Renee had done a lot of thinking lately about structure, about protecting everybody going forward, about not leaving things to chance. Heads nodded around the table. Then she said that starting this month, she'd be handling the family's finances directly, all of it, and that the first steps had already been taken. Then she turned to me, and her voice dropped into that particular gentleness people use when they've already made the decision and just want it to sound kind. She said, "Walter, we took care of your insurance situation this week. It was getting to be too much of a burden for you to manage on your own at your age. Anything you need, you just talk to Marcus." Marcus nodded, staring at his plate. Glasses lifted around the table. One of Diane's old colleagues said something about how sharp that was, how men my age get taken advantage of constantly if nobody steps in. Someone else called it responsible, and I sat there at the wobbly end of the table, getting congratulated for my own quiet erasure. I looked down at my hands, flat against the tablecloth, steady. I noticed that, and I held on to it. Then I set my glass down and stood up slow, because my knees don't do anything fast these days. I looked at my daughter, and I said, "Renee, you have no idea what you just did, do you?" Her fork stopped halfway to her mouth. The whole table went still, a different kind of still than before, the kind that shows up right before the direction of a room changes and nobody in it understands why yet. To explain the rest, I need to take you back 30 years, to the coldest winter of my life. My wife's name was Carol. We met at a clam bake the summer after high school, and she was the one who made talking easy, which mattered, because I've never been much good at it myself. In 1996, she was diagnosed with early-onset multiple sclerosis. For 4 years, I watched a woman who used to fill an entire room with her laugh get smaller and quieter by the season. I learned how to help her dress, how to cook meals she could still manage, how to carry her up the stairs when her legs stopped listening to her. I would give anything, still, to have those hard years back. She died in the spring of 2000. Renee was 9 years old. I remember driving home from the hospital that night with the wipers going against a light rain and passing my own street twice, because my brain had simply stopped producing thoughts and was just running the truck on muscle memory. One block at a time, I kept telling myself, "Get home before Renee wakes up. Get your face right. Figure out what a man says to a 9-year-old about this." That was the entire assignment that night. Not grief. Not the future. Just get home and stay standing. She was already awake when I walked in, sitting at the kitchen table in her nightgown. She looked up and asked if her mother was gone. I said yes. She didn't cry, and neither did I, and we just sat there in a house that had gotten too big and too quiet overnight. Carol had always been the one who knew what to say. Without her, we were just two quiet people learning how to be quiet together. The bills started the next week. Hospital costs, the funeral, a second mortgage we'd taken out the year before to cover a home health aid, and then a letter from the boatyard saying my hours were being cut back for the winter season. 3 envelopes on the kitchen table on a Saturday night, and a cup of coffee that went cold while I read them, the baseboard heater ticking on and off, snow coming down outside like it had nowhere else in the world to be. I sat there a long time. Then I made the one real decision of my life. I decided I was not going to come apart. Not because I didn't have the right to. I had every right in the world. But there was a 9-year-old down the hall who needed one steady person left standing, and I was all that remained. So I squared those letters into a neat stack, put them in a drawer, and went to bed. One thing at a time. What I understood back then was wood and resin and long hours. What I didn't understand was money past a paycheck. That changed because of a man named Arthur Pruitt. About 8 months after Carol passed, I picked up a weekend job repairing a rotted dock at a marina over in Warren that had gone half to ruin. The place was falling apart, piling soft at the waterline. A boat lift that hadn't worked in years, slips nobody wanted to rent because the whole property looked abandoned. I fixed the immediate problem in a weekend, then went back and traced it to what had actually caused it, a drainage issue nobody had touched in a decade. Arthur owned the marina. He was 68, sharp-eyed, and he watched me work most of that second day without saying much. When I packed up my tools, he said, "Most men fix what's broken. You go find what broke it. We stood on that dock in the cold for 2 hours talking, and neither of us made a move to leave. Arthur told me how he'd bought that marina for almost nothing back in the 70s, precisely because it was falling apart and in a location everybody else had written off. He fixed it slow, piece by piece, and used what it earned to buy the next rundown property and the one after that. Then he explained things out loud. I'd never heard a man say cash flow, depreciation, why the ugly properties in good spots were worth more than the pretty ones in bad spots. Because most people can't or won't do the work, and I could. He never offered me a partnership or a dime. He just talked the way an older man talks to a younger one when he sees something in him worth not wasting. I drove home and wrote down every word of it on a legal pad, both sides, small handwriting. 6 months later, I bought my first property, a derelict boat storage yard on the edge of town that had sat empty for 2 years, weeds through the gravel, one building with a collapsed roof. I paid $19,000 for it with a loan from a credit union whose manager had known my father, and I rebuilt it myself, nights after my shift, weekends when Renee had a sleepover and the house was quiet. New roof, new fencing, new gravel, a coat of paint with a roller from the hardware store. Renee was 9, 10 that year. Some Saturdays, she'd sit on an overturned bucket and hand me tools without being asked. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. I'd get her an ice cream on the way home. That was the shape of us for years, not distant, just quiet. Two people who kept showing up for each other without ever announcing it out loud. The storage yard filled up within a year, steady money coming in every month. The second one came 18 months after that, another marina, half dead, that nobody else wanted. Then a small boatyard with the good bones, already covered head to toe. Then more. In 2004, I rolled it all into a company called Narragansett Harbor Holdings, with a careful lawyer's help, and I kept my personal accounts entirely separate. My name never showed up anywhere public. By the time I was done, I owned 4 marinas, 2 boat storage yards, and the boat repair business people still know me for, worth somewhere north of $4 million, throwing off close to $22,000 a month. And I never told Renee. Not a word. She went to a state school on what she thought was a partial scholarship and a stack of loans that were actually being paid off quietly through a trust she never knew existed. Once she thanked me for gas money I slipped her during finals week. I told her she'd earned it, and she had. I stayed quiet on purpose, because I'd watched what happens to a young person who knows money is coming before they've built anything of their own. It makes a person wait instead of build, expect instead of earn. I wanted my daughter to become someone who'd have turned out fine either way. She did. She became exactly that woman. Right up until Diane started quietly rewriting the story around her. Now here's the part I want you to sit with, because Diane isn't a cartoon villain in her own head. I found out later her first husband had lost almost everything in his 50s, a bad business partnership, some investments that turned out to be built on nothing, and by the time anyone caught it, there wasn't much left to save. She watched that happen up close as a young wife, and she swore she'd never let a family go down like that again on her watch. So, when she looked at me, a quiet old man in a canvas jacket who fixed boats for a living, she didn't see a father. She saw a liability that needed managing before it could cost her family anything. In her mind, she was the responsible one, the protector. And that belief is exactly what let her justify all of it. That's the thing about control. Sometimes it's just old fear wearing a nicer coat. It started slow, the way these things do. About a year after Diane moved in, Renee started calling less. Then came what I came to think of as the concern campaign. Diane began asking questions dressed up as care. Did I have a plan in place? Was I managing all right on my own since Carol? Had I looked into long-term insurance? Renee started repeating versions of the same questions, in phrasing just a little too close to Diane's own to be entirely her own idea. She'd show up with printed articles about scams targeting men my age, highlighted in yellow marker, and set them on my kitchen table and say, "She just worries about you, Dad. She's seen a lot in her career." Then came visits that started feeling like inspections. Diane glancing over the mail on my counter, asking pointed questions about my blood pressure, once looking around my kitchen and asking, real gentle, whether the house was getting to be too much upkeep for a man on his own. I've lived in that house since 1994. I know every neighbor's name. Half of them I've helped with a leaking roof or a stuck window at some point. I said nothing. I just started paying closer attention. Then Renee asked me to sign a limited authorization so Marcus could help manage my banking if anything ever happened to me. She said it like it was nothing at all. 2 weeks later, she came back with a form Diane had already printed and half filled out. I looked it over, told her I'd have my own attorney review it first, and put it in my kitchen drawer. I want you to understand what was going through me in that moment, because it wasn't anger. It was a deep, cold sadness. My own daughter was standing in my kitchen holding a piece of paper meant to take my life out of my own hands, and she genuinely believed she was doing me a kindness. Then came that afternoon at the pharmacy, the canceled insurance. The pharmacist repeating the number twice like maybe I hadn't heard it right. I drove home and called my insurance company directly, and a representative explained, careful and polite, that my policy had been modified at the request of an authorized contact, citing concerns about my ability to manage my own affairs. That contact was my daughter. I sat with the phone in my hand a long moment. Then I set it down on the counter and looked out my kitchen window at the backyard, at the spot where Renee used to catch fireflies in a mason jar on summer nights, where Carol used to sit on the back steps in the evenings when the weather turned soft. I stood there a while. Then I picked the phone back up and called my attorney, a careful, unhurried man named Franklin Boyd who has never once wasted a sentence in his life. I said, "It's time." He said, "Give me 5 weeks." I told him he had them. Over those 5 weeks, Franklin built a complete package. Property deeds, current appraisals from 2 independent firms, every lease and vendor contract, 10 years of company financials, all of it bound and tabbed. A legal opinion confirming that the authorization Renee had signed didn't extend to anything held under Narragansett Harbor Holdings, which predated her marriage and sat entirely outside anyone else's reach. And his office logged every single attempt to modify my personal accounts during that stretch, every date, every time, every request, all of it documented and stamped. And here's the part that tells you everything about patience. During those 5 weeks, I called Renee twice. Ordinary calls. How's Toby doing? How's work? How's the new roof holding up? I said nothing about the insurance, nothing about Franklin. I fixed a squeaky hinge on my porch door. I split some firewood. I waited. Not because I had no other choice, but because I knew exactly what I was waiting for. So now we're back at that Thanksgiving table. Diane had made her announcement. My insurance had been quietly reworked without my knowledge. My daughter had nodded along with it. The room was full of approval, and I just stood up and asked Renee if she understood what she'd actually done, and the whole table was holding its breath. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out my phone, and dialed. Franklin picked up on the first ring, exactly as we'd arranged. I said, "Come on over." Diane's smile flickered. She said, "Walter, who on earth are you calling?" And every trace of that practiced warmth had drained straight out of her voice. Marcus pushed his chair back and said, "Mom, what's going on here?" And then the front door opened, and a gust of cold air and a little swirl of wet snow came in with it. Franklin Boyd stepped inside, stamping snow off his shoes, unhurried, in a dark wool overcoat, carrying a worn leather satchel he'd had longer than I'd known him. Silver at the temples, reading glasses tucked in his shirt pocket, the slow, even walk of a man who stood in enough rooms to know he doesn't have to perform for anybody. He said, "Good evening. I represent Walter Kessler." I watched every face at that table turn toward him. I watched the fire keep crackling low in the good fireplace. Somewhere upstairs, the baby monitor hummed softly, and it felt like the whole room leaned back to make space for whatever was coming next. He set the satchel down in the middle of the table, right between the turkey and the good china Diane had picked out special for the occasion, and opened it. Folders, deeds, appraisals, 10 years of financials bound and tabbed. Nobody was eating anymore. Nobody was talking. One of Diane's old colleagues set her fork down so carefully it barely made a sound. Franklin opened the first folder and spoke without any weight on the words at all, just facts laid down plain. He said Walter Kessler is the sole owner of Narragansett Harbor Holdings, formed in Rhode Island in 2004. The company holds 4 marinas, 2 boat storage facilities, and a full-service repair yard across Bristol County. Current combined appraised value is just over $4 million. Diane laughed, short and sharp, the sound a person makes when they're stalling for time. She said, "That's simply not possible." Nobody laughed along with her. Franklin slid a page across the table to Marcus. He said the average net income runs $22,000 a month, all accounts current, no debt held against any of the properties. Marcus picked the page up, set it down, picked it back up. His hands weren't steady. I watched my son-in-law read a number that rewrote everything he thought he understood about the old man who fixed the transom on his sailboat every spring for free. Franklin laid down a second page. The authorization Renee Kessler signed does not extend to any asset held by the company. It's unenforceable as written. All changes made to Mr. Kessler's personal insurance and accounts have been reversed as of this morning. Then he set down a third page, face up, so everyone at the table could read the heading. Every attempt to modify or restrict Mr. Kessler's accounts over the past 5 weeks has been logged and documented by legal counsel. No further action is being pursued at this time, provided there are no additional attempts. Then he closed the satchel, straightened his coat, and said, "That concludes the summary." He walked back out into the snow, just as quietly as he'd come in. The room stayed frozen a long moment. Nobody looked at anybody else. The fire kept popping low in the grate. Diane was the first to speak, and her voice had changed completely, stripped bare of every soft thing she'd worn all evening. What was underneath it wasn't cruelty. It was fear, the particular fear of a person who watched security disappear once and built her whole life around making sure it never happened again. She looked at me and said, "You let us worry about you this entire time. You were sitting on a fortune." I looked back at her, steady. I said, "I never told anyone. That's not the same thing as hiding it." She said it was exactly the same. I said, "No, it isn't. I never once made a decision about your life without your knowledge or your say-so. You did that to me this week. Those aren't the same thing, and I think you know that." She didn't have an answer for that. Then Renee looked up from the papers, and her eyes were red, and she said, "Dad, why didn't you ever tell me?" I sat back down in that wobbly chair at the end of the table, because I wanted to say this looking her in the eye. And this is the part I'd want you to hear, wherever you're listening from tonight, if you take nothing else away from an old man's story. I told her I stayed quiet because I wanted her to become who she is without my money ever making her choices for her, and she did exactly that. She became a woman who works, who shows up, who handles things herself. I told her I was proud of that. But somewhere along the way, someone convinced her that her own father was a problem that needed managing, and she'd used her own name to lock me out of my own life over it. That was the part I couldn't set down easy. Never the money. Not once the money. She didn't have an answer either. The room didn't have one for either of us. Diane picked up her coat, said something under her breath, I won't repeat, and walked out into the snow. The door closed behind her, with a sound that carried longer than it should have. Everybody else cleared out fast after that muttered goodbyes at the door, headlights backing down the driveway one after another into the dark. When the house was finally quiet, Renee sat at the table with the papers spread in front of her, and I stayed in my chair, and neither of us said a word for a long while, and that was fine. We were always better at sitting together than talking. She came by my place most days for the next month, sat at my kitchen table after work, and we talked more in those few weeks than we had in the previous few years combined. Some of it was about Diane, how slowly the whole thing had crept in, how she never noticed it hardening around her until she was already standing inside it. Some of it was about her mother, things she'd never known because she was only 9 when Carol died, and there are questions a 9-year-old doesn't think to ask. And some of it was just ordinary a problem at Marcus's office, the squeaky hinge, the firewood. One evening she started to apologize, the long, drawn-out kind, and I told her to stop. I didn't want an apology. I wanted her to understand what had happened clearly enough that she'd recognize it coming if it ever came at her again from some other direction. She listened the way she used to when she was a girl, and I was showing her how something worked. That was enough for me. Marcus had a hard conversation with his mother that same month, and worked through the fallout of it one piece at a time, without running from any part of it. And I set up a trust for Toby that same week, nothing before he turns 25, split 3 ways between his education, a first home, and a reserve. In that order. When he's old enough, I'll sit that boy down myself and tell him exactly where every dollar of it came from. Every dock I rebuilt. Every night I worked after his mother was asleep. Every decision, one at a time. And here's what people got wrong about how I handled Diane. I didn't try to destroy her, and I could have. I didn't go to her old firm or make a single call I could have made. Not because she'd earned that mercy. because ruining her wouldn't have put a single thing back the way it should have been, and I've never had much use for something that only feels good in the moment. I made sure Toby was protected, and I let the rest of it go. Some of the family thought I went too easy on her. I wasn't being easy. I was being precise about the difference between what actually helps and what only feels satisfying for an afternoon. If you've ever confused getting even with getting free, sit with that a while, because they are not the same thing, and only one of them lets you sleep at night. These days I still drive the same old pickup with the dent in the tailgate. I still wear the canvas jacket. Last week I rebuilt a transom on one of my own boats down at the yard just because I felt like using my hands again, and Renee sat on a bucket the whole afternoon and asked me questions the way she did when she was a girl. That was a good afternoon. That was as rich as I've ever felt in my life. So here's what all of it taught me. And it isn't really about the money at all. The quiet you carry can be the strongest thing you own, but only if you're the one choosing it, and not just swallowing it because somewhere along the way you started believing you didn't matter enough to speak up. And the people who move on what they think they can take from you will always show you exactly who they are, if you're patient enough to let them. So here's the one thing I'd ask you to actually do this week, not out of fear, but out of respect for yourself. If you're getting on in years, get your affairs in order before somebody decides to order them for you. A trust and a company structure aren't just for the wealthy. They're for anyone who refuses to be made invisible in their own family. Find your Franklin. And here's the question I want to leave you with tonight. When was the last time your quiet got mistaken for weakness? And what might change if the people around you understood that the ones who say the least have usually been paying attention the longest? I want to hear from you, family. Tell me one if you think I did right waiting it out and letting the truth land on its own timing. Tell me two if you'd have said something the second that announcement started. Tell me three if you honestly don't know what you'd have done, because I'm not sure any of us really know until we're the ones sitting in that wobbly chair at the end of our own table. And tell me where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are, because it still gets me every time thinking about how far these stories travel. And if you've ever been made to feel small in a room full of your own people, tell me about it. Somebody scrolling past tonight needs to know they're not the only one who's felt that. If this one meant something to you, the best thing you can do is stick around, because I've got more of these to tell. Thank you for sitting with me tonight, family. I'll see you in the next one. Real strength was never the money in the bank. It was the patience to hold your dignity quietly, while the people who doubted you revealed exactly who they were. Walter didn't win by punishing anyone. He won by staying steady, forgiving without forgetting, and protecting the ones worth protecting. Sometimes the softest voice in the room has simply been paying attention the longest, and love, given without keeping score, always finds its way back home. A small note for you. This story was written and fictionalized by AI purely for entertainment, though we hope its gentle life lesson stays with you a little longer.